have 9 questions I wanted to ask you about your book and your writing.
Perfect.
Okay.
Awesome.
So the first question is pretty basic. It's just what got you into poetry.
Sure. So I've always been a writer. I think in the way that a lot of writers have always been writers.
Yeah.
Like, it's just the way that they understand how to communicate with the world from the time that they're very young, whether that's through keeping a journal. I kind of kept journals, but I just always found that, like, I loved writing short stories. And then I came to poetry when I was pretty young. I was always someone who enjoyed reading aloud to myself. I really loved hearing words read aloud. And so when I was pretty young, I started writing poems and reading them aloud to, like, my family and friends. And then that, when I was in high school, that manifested into getting involved in spoken word poetry. I was an athlete and was just kind of getting over it. I just didn't want to play sports anymore. And in the way that many high schoolers do, I felt like I kind of had to choose one identity. And it was like, all right, I'm not an athlete, I'm an artist. And I think in retrospect, I wish that I would have understood you could be both. But so I joined my poetry club at my high school and started doing spoken word. And I just really never stopped. It became something that when I first saw it done, I thought it was like a magical spell, like I could not fathom I could not fathom how these spoken word poets were doing it.
Yeah.
And immediately was like, I'm going to try to do this. And so I started doing it and just, like, made a lot of really close friends who were also poets, and that kind of kept me in the community. And it went from being a sort of emotional outlet to being a hobby to being a habit. Like, it was just really weird if I wasn't on a slam team or working towards a slam team. And then, and then now it's just like, it's my job. And so it's the way that I understand how to process the world. And it's the community that I'm in. It's everything I do. So.
But like it says on your website, and you did all this speak, like you got really invested in Title IX stuff and going to universities. And can you talk a little bit about that, like how you got invested in that, and like why you did it, and like what you did actually when you went to universities, in case, because like not everyone knows about all that.
Sure. Yeah. So my work with Title IX stuff started with Megan. We went on a tour that was just initially, like, the idea was that we wanted to read poems. We wanted to go to schools and read poems, and we didn't have any sort of specific mission. But we noticed what people's ears were perking up at in our set, which our set at the time covered a broad range of topics. We didn't really have, like, a honed-in focus yet, but we noticed that, that colleges were really craving thorough, accurate, and also entertaining education around sexual assault prevention. And so we noticed that and started to curate our show based on that need, which made it more tenable as a job as well. The idea that, like, doing poetry as a job became more realistic when we could offer something bigger than just our name, but what that was valuable in terms of what we can offer the student body in education. And so that's kind of how we started to learn more about Title IX. Title IX is the requirement that schools provide, like I said, accurate and thorough education around gender discrimination, gendered violence, sexual assault prevention. So, and now it covers a lot about, like, the sort of rights and requirements around trans students on college campuses. Yeah. And, as many people know, like, colleges don't have a lot of effective methods around dealing with sexual assault on campus. And in many ways, the way they deal with it is by not dealing with it at all.
Yeah.
So students are being sexually assaulted in super high numbers, and then are having to share classrooms with their assailants, and are being driven out of their communities. And so the problem is that there is this requirement for Title IX, but schools often end up doing kind of the bare minimum. So they end up only teaching about it once with a really boring PowerPoint and some pamphlets at a freshman orientation, and the students' eyes are glazing over and they're learning nothing, and they're not learning what consent looks like, and they're not learning what sexual assault looks like, and so it's not changing anything.
It was very much like sexual assault will be someone you barely know, and it will always be a man enacting it, and it will always just be sex.
Exactly.
And it was never like women can commit sexual assault. It was never like it could be your long-term partner. Because that was what happened to me. It was my long-term partner, and so it took so long for my brain to wrap around the fact that, like, oh, wait, I'm not ever saying yes to this. Like...
Yeah, you know, I think that it's really interesting you say that, because I also, like, you know, was sexually assaulted by my long-term partner multiple times, and
same.
Didn't register it as being that until I started teaching about sexual assault. Like,
it's crazy.
I remember, like, knowing that I knew about these things in a really intimate way and not knowing why, and being like, why am I so able to talk about this? Why do I feel like I'm qualified? And I realized it was because what I had experienced was something that so many people I had experienced, and that it wasn't being named as sexual assault, but that I was teaching it as sexual assault. And I was like, okay, wait a second. So I need to, like, go back on my life and reassess what I experienced. And, like, that's the problem with the fact that with the way that we teach about what sexual assault looks like, we teach about it as this man in an alley in a ski mask, you know, and we don't learn that most of the time it's our friends, it's our partners, it's, like, in a dorm room.
Gender and sexuality obviously play a big part in your poetry. Can you, like, talk about that, like your gender, sexuality, like what you've experienced in life, and how you started deciding you wanted it to incorporate in your poetry, or did it just naturally come out in your poetry?
Yeah, you know, I think it really naturally came out. I think that, like, as writers, we write what we know to be true, and I think that, like, what I wrote about from the time that I was a teenager, I was writing about the things I was processing. And when I was a teenager, I was processing what it meant to be a teenage girl in the world, you know? And so much of what it meant to be a teenage girl in the world also meant analyzing the ways I was being objectified, and analyzing, you know, my rage and, like, my sexuality and all of those things. And so I think that it just kind of happened really naturally, and then became more intentional when I started to teach about Title IX compliance, because obviously when I became an educator, it put more of a responsibility on me as a writer to not only, like, make sure that I'm covering most or everything what I need to cover, but also talking about it in a way that's, like, safe and helpful.
I love when things start with epigraphs and quotes, and you started the whole book with a quote from The Girls by Emma Klein. The constant project of our girl cells seeming to require odd and precise attentions. And The Girls is, like, one of my favorite books in the world. So when I saw that, I was like, she's speaking my language. So can you talk about, like, what, you know, like, where you found the inspiration for, like, the different quotes you use for each section? And, like, I thought that was such a perfect way to start the whole book, because it does kind of, like, you know, bring it all together, that it is just, like, about literally the existence of being a young girl.
So I also loved The Girls, and when I read it, it was one of those books that I read it and wished that I had written it. Like, I just read it and was like, I wish I wrote this book.
You read it and you're like, why try anymore? Like, Emma Klein already did it. Like,
and so that's how I felt when I read The Girls. And I went through a lot of different quotes from that book, like, trying to figure out what would be the first one, what would be the quote I used. And I liked that quote in particular because of the word project, and the title of New American Best Friend is, like, very intentional, because the idea is, like, you know, the book explores me moving out of the country to Trinidad when I was 10 and returning when I was 13, and having to become new versions of myself, which I think, regardless of if you've left the country or not, like, I think that being a teenager in general is a process of becoming new versions of yourself. And it does feel like a project in becoming. Like, you're, like, constantly trying to figure out, like, what I said about choosing an identity between an athlete and an artist. And you're constantly figuring out who you are and what you are to the world and why you're important. And sometimes it's genuine, and sometimes it's forced, and sometimes, you know, you're pushed into that identity. And and sometimes you're just trying to replicate the identity of someone you admire. And so I loved the idea of the self being a project, which I think that to be so in line with what it feels like to be a teenager. And so that quote stuck out to me in particular.
It's just such a it feels very much like in the vibe of the girls, that very like poignant, even though all these other negative things are happening in the world, the girlhood becoming womanhood is like the center narrative. Because I always thought like the girls was so fascinating that it was like fictionalizing the Charles Manson murders, but the Charles Manson character and the actual murders were like such a footnote to what was actually going on. Like I forgot, right. I kept forgetting that like that's what we were fictionally I was like, oh, that's right, like a horrible mass murder is gonna happen at some point, because you're just so focused on the girls. And so I felt like, well, your book was like you know, harassment, assault, and sexism, and like you know queer phobia were all like elements. It was still all coming back to your existence.
Yes.
And I thought that was such a beautiful thing, because I feel like so many times even like outer elements become the main characters, which isn't necessarily bad. I just think it takes like it's harder to make the outer elements not dictate the voice of the narrator, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that was something like when I teach classes to young people, when I teach poetry classes, I always, like, after we read a poem or watch a poem, I always say, what is this poem about? And I always prep them by saying, when I ask what this poem is about, I'm not asking what happened in the poem. I'm asking what topics and ideas is this poem juggling, right? Because I want them to understand that you can tell a story and never once say, hey, this is a poem about sexism, or this is a poem about, capitalism.
Yeah.
But you can just tell a story, and it can be very clear that the poem is about that. And so that's what I tried to do with New American, or that's not even what I tried to do, it's just kind of the way that I think. But I think with New American Best Friend, what I wanted to explore specifically really was like, the fact of the matter is that like my women friends and my girlfriends saved my life, growing up. And for so long in my life, I rejected that idea. I was definitely a girl who was like, at some point was like, I don't hang out with other girls. Like they cause too much drama, and I'm not like other girls, and I only like hanging out with boys. And it's again that cyclical thing, because when I was young, I wasn't that way, and then patriarchy got to me, and I became that way, and then I came back to like now everyone in my life is either like everyone in my life is like a queer femme person, and that is how I choose my life to be. And I think that with New American Best Friend, I wanted to tell a bunch of stories about this deep intimacy between girls, whether it's teaching each other to shave your legs or literally putting in a tampon for one another. And then also the violence around not hanging out with girls. Like the poem Backpedal is about hanging out with all boys and the violence that took place there.
But this has been so great. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciated it. This has been